Hello, listeners. It's been a while. I untangled my microphone on the corner of the desk, and as I speak to you today, I hope this broadcast finds you well, and in the case it doesn't, maybe afterwards you'll be feeling much better. The heat of today has me feeling like I'm born of a different time, and I'm a walk-on character in Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing. So here we are in the cool, indeterminate space of the online, talking about the 12th house. As I saw someone refer to themselves in the internets today, I'm clickbait on the streets and a think piece in the sheets. So where should I, someone with a 12th house sun and Mercury in my natal chart, begin speaking on the 12th house? Neptune rules the 12th house. We could say Pisces rules the 12th house as well. So if you revisit the Neptune episode, you'll hear commentary on exile and incarceration, illusions and dreams, being locked inside the mind, perhaps tapped into those feels that can't quite be expressed but still exist in the ether. It's been a good 4 months. I use the word good in a colloquial sense. That's primarily because I'm going through a tough 12th house transit. So with Saturn solidly transiting my 12th, I've been revisiting the past and dealing with unaddressed issues I've pushed into the unconscious. As they come up from the mud now, and as the national conversation in the United States has moved to how we treat those with pervasive mental illness, as in the public suicides of people like Anthony Bourdain have recently been discussed quite widely, how we lock people in cages and break family bonds, no different than how the U.S. has treated indigenous people and other people of color, especially during slavery, not just with migrants, but with people who have been historically policed for having different bodies, women. And as I work on a dissociation largely in isolation out here in northern Appalachia, there's no better time to visit the 12th house for others to ponder. Where to go first? And there's the meandering of the 12th house. So what a question for this particular show, since to explore this house is to address how we cross into the liminal space between life and rebirth. It's a deeply spiritual house, and because of that, it's mangled and misunderstood. One of the greatest challenges with having a 12th house sun, for instance, is people projecting their unresolved narratives onto you. This happens to me a lot. If you revisit the episode on Neptune, I discuss having no boundaries. And if you revisit the episode on Virgo and Mercury, we talk about what good boundaries are. So boundaries are a tough topic because, as with borders, if we have borders, they require violence to enforce them. The 12th house is not violence, but surrender to all that remains to be seen. In many ways, it's about trusting there's a purpose to everything. Yes, this can seem like it's excusing behaviors which cause harm, calling them lessons, when we actually have the power to create a better buffer between others and pain. The 12th house inevitably reminds me of my father, a Pisces sun. They say having a 12th house sun like myself, even though I'm an Aquarius, makes me almost like an honorary Pisces. Recently, I've also begun to revisit the 12 steps. And for those of you not familiar with the 12-step program for addictions and codependency, I'll revisit this later in the podcast. It seems like no coincidence that the 12th house is the house of addictions and the AA, or Alcoholics Anonymous 12 steps of recovery, are so numbered, 12. And of course, we should also credit and take a look at the remarkable work of Tracy Marks and Your Secret Self, Illuminating the Mysteries of the 12th House. Right now, it's time for a musical interlude. This is Water Features with stock photos of hot air balloons.
What will you find in the portfolios of America's most successful people?
Imagine a flock of seagulls. Not a flock of seagulls stock photo, but the band, A Flock of Seagulls from the 80s. So you remember their haircuts and their glam, and you remember their top hit, I Ran. Well, think about the 12th house as A Flock of Seagulls, I Ran music video. We have the illusions of Neptune, the hairspray, the sunglasses, the powder, pancake makeup, and how the camera pans all over the instruments and the way that we kind of project our own ideas of who these people are in the band onto them as we see them within all the glitz. Because the 12th house is a place where everyone can reach you, but no one can. So while we might think we can see what's happening, there's something underneath that urges us maybe to dig deeper, and depending on our level of consciousness, we may or may not do that. It's the collective, and access to that collective, yet an isolation that can only come from knowing too much. When I think of the 12th house, I think of the phrase, alone in a crowd. And therein lies the projection that sometimes happens in the 12th house, where we project maybe our own values onto something that, whether we're realizing or not, we perceive as an object. So think about what I reflected on earlier in the podcast about prisons. Think about incarcerated people. Now, with this recent media storm of understanding what's been going on in detention centers in the US, maybe we should call them cages, people project their own idea of rightness onto this situation. And usually it has to do with their own value system. So for instance, some people don't see migrants as humans. That's sick and twisted, but we know that that's the case. There's some people who see those who don't look like them and they say, well, these people aren't my concern. So there's quite a bit of an element of xenophobia and racism in this situation. And again, that all has to do with projection. What do you fear that you're projecting onto those people who you're viewing as objects? And this is where the 12th house comes in as well, because we go to the 12th house sometimes to escape and to dive into the things that nobody wants to see. So when we talk about people who are addicted to substances, they're trying to go somewhere that's private but not, somewhere where they can access maybe the Akashic records, this potentially mythical place where all of our memories, hopes, and fears reside. This is Dazie Mae with Some of My Fears.
Half of one house is left unserved. I'm good with numbers, haven't you heard? I have to contract, I have lost everything. Just like the boxer dead on the ring. The cross is twisted, the stars that not shine. Depression's threatening, the worry is mine. The king was singing, and now he's dead. John wanted peace, and it's war instead. The sum of my fears, the sum of my fears. The sum of my fears, the sum of my fears. Last year the winter was before the fall. There was no summer, could they kill them all? Thought I could hide my eyes from the sun. Then Dylan's rain came to shoot like a gun. The wine in my cup does not taste like wine. I should drink water, this cancer is mine. Just a witness, one hand on my heart. For the guilty, the body can't stop. The sum of my fears, the sum of my fears. The sum of my fears, the sum of my fears.
I promised we'd talk about the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, or AA, or if you're a codependent, it would be Al-Anon. And there's also adult children of alcoholics, people who grew up with parents who had a variety of addictions themselves and may become codependent, as in becoming addicted to relationships where you have to, or you try to, have some type of control by attempting to fix someone else. So here are the 12 steps, promises, and traditions of AA. The first one is we admitted we were powerless, that our lives had become unmanageable. The second one, we came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. 3, we made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood Him. So that little turn of phrase is written in italics, as we understood Him. So for those of us who believe in the power of the universe, the ancestors, and all of that, this is still accessible for you. Made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. That's number 4. Number 5, admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. 6, we're entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. 7, humbly asked to have these shortcomings removed. 8, made a list of persons we had harmed and become willing to make amends to them all. 9, made direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. 10, continued to take personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. 11, sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood them, praying only for knowledge of their will for us and power to carry that out. And the 12th step is having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps. We try to carry this message to other people with addictions and practice these principles in all of our affairs. So I'm going to actually read the 12 promises of AA as well, just keeping with our little theme of 12. If we are painstaking about this phase of our development, we will be amazed before we are halfway through. We are going to know a new freedom and a new happiness. We will not regret the past or wish to shut the door on it. We will comprehend the word serenity, and we will know peace. No matter how far down the scale we have gone, we will see how our experience can benefit others. That feeling of uselessness and self-pity will disappear. We will lose interest in selfish things and gain interest in our fellows. Self-seeking will slip away. Our whole attitude and outlook upon life will change. Fear of people and economic insecurity will leave us. That one's a little sketchy. We will intuitively know how to handle situations which used to baffle us. We will suddenly realize that God is doing for us what we could not do for ourselves. So all of this is to say that if addiction is associated with the 12th house and projection, illusions, what happens when we actively work to uncover these things and be more conscientious about how we're interacting in the world and how we might be perpetuating these illusions? So I'm going to turn to this book. It's called Serenity, a Companion for 12-Step Recovery. And I've had this book kind of sitting around for a long time, but I wanted to read a little excerpt where they talk about the principles that Bill Wilson, the founder of AA, pursued in his recovery. And so this was through the Oxford group. So this would be the predecessor of AA. And what they would say is you need to have a complete deflation of false pride, a dependence and guidance from a higher power, take a moral inventory, confess, there needs to be restitution, and continued work with other suffering persons. So there's definitely a service element to recovery where we're trying to be less in the ego and less self-absorbed. So again, if we look at the dissolving of Neptune, the dissolving of ego that generally happens, especially when we pass from one life to the next, then we can see how AA tries to tap that and tries to understand ego death, which occurs in the 12th house. So step 1 is interesting to me. We admitted we were powerless over our dependencies and that our lives had become unmanageable. So I'll read a little excerpt from Serenity again. Admitting powerlessness runs contrary to many of our cultural messages that say, be strong, be the master of your own destiny. The admission of powerlessness also conflicts with the addictive message because the addiction itself will tell us, you have a high tolerance. Use more of me, you can handle it. Nevertheless, the central paradox of step 1 is that the admission of complete defeat permits a life-transforming victory through recovery. The admission of powerlessness over an addiction actually becomes the foundation for the strength to eventually overcome the dependency. Admitting powerlessness is absolutely essential to breaking the addiction cycle, which is made up of these 5 points. So I found this illuminating. The 5 points of the addiction cycle are 1, pain, and then all of these directly correlate with each other. Pain leads to reaching out to an addictive agent such as work, food, sex, alcohol, or dependent relationships to solve our pain. The next one is temporary anesthesia that comes when we pursue the addiction. And the next one is negative consequences. And the final one is shame and guilt, which result in more pain and low self-esteem. So think about something that you do that you know is not particularly good for your mental health. I would think you'd find these steps to be pretty spot on. I mean, I know I do. And I think some of that seeking does come from a space of ego where we're saying, how can I feel more powerful while using this type of substance? So is this meant to completely be negative all the time? I mean, if it were, why would we have any type of thing that anesthetizes us? You know, I mean, why would we have the beautiful smell of a scented candle, for instance, as I'm lighting one? Why would we have the gorgeous, smell of fresh cut grass? And that's a personal, idea of mine. But what about joy? When we experience joy, aren't we feeling this type of release from pain? So I guess looking more, retrospectively at AA, and I know it helps a lot of people, we can kind of see how these steps can help us understand what is truly bringing joy and what is just a temporary thing to make us feel more powerful, especially if that power has to do with stepping over other people in order to feel that power, or using other people. So another problem with the 12th house that 12th housers find is that they try to see the best in everyone. And while that can be wonderful and, especially a blessing for people who generally others don't see them in a good light, it can also bring up problems, because if you have someone who craves absolute power and seniority and whatever else, and you have another person and they try to see the best in everyone, then there's this great chance that they'll be taken advantage of. And that does ultimately cause pain. So I feel as though life doesn't have any easy answers in regards to these principles, but I feel like we definitely need to look at where our egos lie. Are they centered in raising us up? Like in the podcast episode on the sun, we talked about how you need to shine your light and have your own personality and recognize that you have a very important purpose here, while also not stepping all over other people and just kind of bragging all the time, or just feeling like it's your universe and everyone else just lives in it. Because we are all connected, and that's what the 12th house teaches us, is that we're all together in this. And there was a study that came out too recently. The social worker Jessica Dore shared this, and it was a study that just said that individualism causes the opposite of what it's supposed to, which is success and feelings of purpose and fulfillment. And that it's only when we begin to see that the lives of others are connected to ours that we can really transcend life circumstances, pain, and make this world better. This is Haunted Corpse with Creature from Beyond the Grave. It took me a few days to compile this podcast, which is unusual for me, but maybe usual during this 12th house transit. Since I have so many planets packed in there, I'm having to deal with a lot of unconscious things that are, well, they're not unconscious anymore, I'll tell you that. And one of them is sitting with difficult and painful emotions. And so I'd like to read a little portion of Your Secret Self, the book by Tracy Marks that discusses the 12th house. And in this section, she talks about the psychodynamics of 12th house conflicts. And in particular, this little subsection of text is called The Interlude. And she writes, "What happens to the parts of the true self which burrow within us, which dive deep beneath the waters of our 12th house? Many possibilities exist. Sometimes an energy, when completely repudiated, becomes fixated in the id, or our storehouse of repressed primal energy. We experience horizontal splitting. One facet of ourselves becomes completely inaccessible and retreats into the engine room of our 12th house, secretly directing our lives. All our choices and behaviors may then be secretly motivated by hidden fear, Saturn, anger, Mars, desire for glory, Sun, or need for caretaking, Moon. Yet we remain completely unaware of and defended against these particular energies. More frequently, we experience vertical splitting. A part of ourselves does not become completely inaccessible, but appears and disappears from our consciousness without warning. We are somewhat dissociated or fragmented. For example, we may live without awareness of our 12th house Neptune and feel trapped in mundane reality until Neptune bursts forth and unexpectedly intoxicates us with liquor, fantasy, devotion to a guru, or creative inspiration. Then once again, we lose awareness of Neptune and make choices which do not take our 12th house Neptunian needs into consideration. Early traumas may result in fixations. The earlier the trauma, the more likely it is to become part of our psychological structure, which is malleable when we are infants, but progressively becomes rigid. Fixations that develop in order to cope with traumatic feelings early in life may persist, although we have forgotten the original trauma. They may be unrelated to that trauma, a means of keeping it out of consciousness. For example, we incessantly glorify the life of the mind in order to keep from feeling. Or they may be a more direct means of ensuring that the painful original experience or series of experiences will not recur. Perhaps we stole our brother's teddy bear and ripped it up and were unfairly punished when Daddy gave all our Christmas gifts to the little creep on Christmas morning. What a cruel punishment for a Taurus! What intolerable pain and deprivation we felt that day, such terrible pain that we decided never again would we suffer the loss of material possessions which we so dearly wanted." End quote. So, obviously, this example that Marx provides at the end is something that not everyone will experience, because some people did not experience, even parents that would dote on them with gifts. Some people experienced complete parental neglect, and not everyone comes from this type of a privileged culture. So, take or leave the example. But when we have these unresolved issues in our mind, or calcified, that's actually more of a language term, why does someone still speak in this way that's incorrect, say grammatically or whatever? It's in second language acquisition studies, we say that that's a calcified part of speech, and they may have learned that early on when they were first learning a language, and so it stays with them and they keep speaking that way, and it just becomes part of their character. So can the person go back and make a conscious choice to change that calcified language, what should we say, peculiarity? Yes, they can. But, I guess that's what makes us all human and all different too, is that we all have these issues that give us the particular personality that we have. So that doesn't sound very resolute, but I didn't promise resolution for this particular episode. I promised processing. So let's talk a little bit about repression. And Tracy Marks also talks about repression in the same section. And she says, "We repress feelings, impulses, needs, desires, and thoughts which were unacceptable in childhood and which we fear would be unacceptable today. We repress those facets of ourselves which may threaten relationships which are important to us and upon which we depend. We repress that which threatens our identity or self-image, which causes intolerable fear or pain, or which might result in shame or humiliation. If we have poor impulse control, we repress desires which might become uncontrollable impulses and result in loss of control. We also repress parts of ourselves which are so at odds with other parts of ourselves that we are unable to tolerate the anxiety of the inner conflict. Our capacity to regain awareness of repressed 12th house energy may depend upon the relationship in our charts between the kinds of energies in the 12th house and those energies outside it. Can our conscious selves, our egos, absorb and assimilate the 12th house energies without breaking? Certainly. If we have a Pisces Sun, Mercury, and Venus, we may be able to recover the disowned energies of our 12th house Neptune, since we're already identified with many facets of our Neptunian self. But what if we have a Libra stellium and a Pisces moon? And what if our Mars-Jupiter conjunction in Scorpio and the 12th house squares Pluto in Leo? What if we have erected a self-image, value system, lifestyle, and relationship network, all to support the values of love, harmony, and symbolic unity with all of life? How do we account for our Mars, Jupiter, and Scorpio? What happens when transiting Pluto crosses this conjunction and we discover the degree of our hatred and rage before we can awaken to our constructive power? Not only do we develop self-systems and life systems to maintain our repressions, but we also repress experiences which threaten the inner and outer structures we have created, structures which are especially precarious when they are built upon one dimension of ourselves at the expense of its opposite. The more we identify with one facet of ourselves and the need that identification in order to have an identity and maintain our self-esteem, the more we repress the opposite qualities. So think about this for a moment. For instance, for somebody who has Mars in the 12th house, somebody with Mars in the 12th house might say to themselves, or may act like they never get angry about anything. But with Mars sitting squarely in the 12th house, that shows me when I read a chart that someone ignores their angry impulses because they learned that it's not okay to be angry at others in relationships, or it's not okay to be angry in public. You shouldn't show your anger because it's not flattering. I mean, there's just a variety of experiences you can have in life early on that teach you to not express your anger. So when I see Mars in the 12th house, for instance, I'd see that they have some issues to work out in terms of repression. But that can be taken in a way that becomes highly evolved. So that person may learn that constructive anger can be good and can change things for the better because you are not blowing up and raising your voice, but you're being constructive towards something that seems unjust to you. So as we think about these repressions, and as we think about the 12th house energies, I want to ask you to think about how you sit with painful emotions and anxiety. I know I have over the last several weeks and honestly months since I've had these 12th house transits kick up. And, how do you deal with your development of your ego? And how is it that, we can have so much anxiety because we think that we can control things? I mean, if we look back at the 12 steps would tell us that we have to let go and let God. And whoever God is for you, I think that that's the case. And sometimes we don't know exactly why we're asked to give up on a certain situation, or why not just give up, but maybe let it go and don't keep such a tight grip on it. But I believe that there is a purpose for doing these things sometimes, and that sitting with painful emotions means that, one, maybe you need to be broken open in order to experience, on the opposite end of the spectrum, certain types of joy. Not to say that you need to feel pain to feel joy, but I have met people who haven't had a lot of life experiences, and it seems as though they don't feel pain as deeply because they haven't felt pain as deeply, but they also don't experience joy maybe as deeply as someone who has experienced certain types of pain. So it's really just something to think about and not something to aspire to feel pain all the time. But I wonder if we think about the ways that we are able to sit with ourselves, how does that feel? And what can we do to better understand those moments where we are by ourselves and maybe asked to meditate instead of react? To close out the show, I want to offer up 2 songs for meditation. The first song is Kyle Preston with A Sea Change, since we're talking about the big C of the 12th house. And the last song is Boss Battle by Mystery Mammal. If you think about video games, when you get to the end of a level, when you're about to level up, there's always the boss battle where we meet the boss. And it's scary at first, but well, depending on how good you are at video games, this might not be a great analogy for you, but think about the boss battles in your own life when it's time to level up. And if you prefer to think of things horizontally and you don't want to think about things in a hierarchical way, you can think of leveling up as moving forward. Or if you prefer to think about things in a non-linear timeline, you can just think of reaching a new experience. Or maybe even reaching an experience that you could have had in previous lifetimes, or that maybe you were too scared to face in previous lifetimes. And what if this boss battle was just with previous versions of yourself? Good night, listeners.